If you don't mind, that'd be a lot better. I could just kind of like point or say next slide, if that's okay with you. It's just terrible. Like normally I always have my clicker the one day, you know.
Well, yeah. If I can track one down, I'll grab one.
Okay.
But other than that, I'll send somebody up there to do the next slide, as long as they can just keep an eye on the recording.
Okay. Sure. Yeah. Test. Test.
All right. So, you use the restroom there? Okay. I already hit the start recording button. Yeah. So, you should see levels coming off the slide. So you need headphones there. Okay. Using headphones through the screen view, what's your name?
For those of you who are in the back of the room, uh, depending on your level of interest with this, there's going to be some demos that are demonstrated throughout the presentation, and some of them may not be as visible in the back, but there's definitely some important things I'll be highlighting within the demos. So if you can't see that well and you want to see smaller text like command line prompts and stuff like that, you may want to come up to the front of the room, or at least a little bit closer if you can.
Sir, this is Willie.
Nice to meet you. H-U-Y? H-U-Y. Okay, gotcha.
What's your name?
Evan Pena.
Evan. Okay. I'm sorry we didn't get to you. The coffee earlier. They took a hold of coffee.
They got me. Yep, we're good to go.
We did have coffee, wasn't it? And we do have speakers here. But they took away the coffee.
Okay. Yeah, I noticed that. I was like out there. I was like, oh man.
We're having some professional services, and so they're using muscle versions, obviously.
Gotcha.
All of that info already.
Got about 1 minute. You can just click whenever I say next slide. Okay. I'll definitely be in a huge rush for that. I'm going to get started in about 1 minute or less. Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. The title is called Keeping Up with APTs, which is like the Advanced Persistent Threat. I'm part of the Mandiant Red Team, and this is a talk about the latest trends that we use on the Red Team to kind of emulate these covert attackers and actually do covert operations for our clients. Next slide. So my name is Evan Pena. I've been with Mandiant's FireEye a little over 6 years. I was pre-acquisition of Mandiant proper before we actually got acquired by FireEye. I'm the global red team lead for Mandiant, and I've been all over. I was kind of in the Alexandria office, which is where Mandiant headquarters is, for 3 years. I moved to Los Angeles. I was out to the West Coast for 3 years as well, and I actually moved back to San Antonio about a year ago, and this is actually my hometown. So this is where I'm based out of. And now I can operate remotely, so it's not a big deal. And I'm very much enjoying being back home. And Joseph, who runs this conference, he's an old mentor of mine from when I was in UTSA in my undergrad. And so him and I have a great relationship, and it's really nice to see him, build out this conference and see the community that we have here in San Antonio. I'm fairly new to the security community in San Antonio, very well, well versed in some of the other communities outside of San Antonio because I was traveling and lived abroad for a while. But really happy to see everyone here and be a part of this community. So like I said, I was a UTSA alumni. I got my master's in George Mason when I was living in Alexandria, and that's in Fairfax. And right out of college, I went and was on the Marine Corps Red Team in Quantico, actually, before I moved to Alexandria. And that was kind of my first hacking experience professionally anyway. And so that was a very good experience to get me started. And some of the background, which you'll kind of notice as we go through these slides, there's a lot of technical stuff when it comes to operating systems, software development, and then also kind of IT. And you kind of have to put all these together to be a pretty effective red teamer, and I'll explain how that works as we go through these slides. But my background has a lot of software development and also IT. When I was in college, I worked throughout college as a sysadmin consultant, doing a lot of sysadmin and server setups and all that, and that really helped me kind of build my career from the start. Slide. So the agenda today is kind of talk to you again about what we're seeing in the wild. So one of the advantages that I have working at FireEye Mandiant is that we do most every big breach in the industry. You'll hear, Sony gets hacked, Target gets hacked, Hobby Lobby or Home Depot, whatever. And we'll go do those investigations. So we get to see what attackers are actually doing in the wild. And then I get that intel, and they'll tell me, hey, Evan, you and your team can implement these methodologies if you want to. This is good. This is not good. This is where you're getting caught. This is where you're not. So this talk is actually going to go through all the latest and coolest things that we do and that we're seeing attackers do as well, and how it's currently bypassing a lot of the detections in the industry. And so it's going to include things like shellcode injection and execution. There's a big difference. I'll explain what that is in a little bit. Command and process execution, persistence, lateral movement, some creative ways of doing red teaming or hacking in general, and then some final thoughts on the matter. We're going to kind of build this out a little bit. So we're going to kind of start from scratch and then build it out, and then we're going to use them in combination of each other, and you'll see how that works in a moment. So this is a basic example of hex shellcode. And what shellcode essentially is a self-contained executable that can be in different formats. But most common format is going to be hex. And generally this is used for process injection. Again, it could be used for process execution. A lot of your commercial or even open source rats, which is like a remote access Trojan, or backdoors, there's a lot of different terms for these sort of things, like Cobalt Strike, Metasploit, Empire. Even if you have one, we have one out for FireEye. We have our own custom C2. And these should all have a shellcode generator for you. So if you want to create just raw shellcode from your payload within any one of these commercial products, you can do so. And so what I'm going to kind of show y'all today is how we're using our builders, our shellcode builders, to kind of expand it and be very covert about it. Next slide, please. So our stage 0 initial vector payload generally used to always be shellcode injection. It still is today. And the reason why is because if you're using shellcode injection versus execution, it's going to inject into a separate process. So if, for example, the user or a defender terminates your process, or even an AV product for that matter, then you'll still remain in memory operating, versus if you're doing like a wait for single object on a create thread, which we'll talk about in a moment, your process will be killed and then that initial vector is done. The reason why it's so important during the stage 0 initial vector process is because, again, you don't know what's on the victim side. You don't know what's on the laptop that you just infected. It could be an AV. It could, again, be a savvy user who just kills your process and then you're done. That was your one vector in. So if you inject initially on the stage 0, it's really important because, again, you'll stay in memory on another process that's likely going to still be running. A great example of that is Explorer, SVC host, things like that. Next slide, please. So some of the most common shellcode injection techniques that we see today create remote thread APIs. And this is a function built into Windows, that any sort of software developer can call to inject into a process. Now, the problem with create remote thread as it speaks right now is there are APIs that Windows provides that AVs are actually using to detect on this activity. And that's something that I found AVs are getting a lot better at, and they're terminating the process before it can even run. And again, they're using these APIs to do that. To give you some examples of how it's done is, for example, if a thread is being created by a different process and the caller is running, obviously that's an easy detection. Same thing with you can target or query target memory for a new thread. I'm going to be mentioning threads a lot, and I'll also explain why that matters here in a moment. So you can query target memory for a new thread, so you can look at the permissions, if it's a DLL versus shellcode, and then you can write, these AVs can write regular expressions around shellcode. That's going to be hex, again, base64, things like that. Next slide, please. So this is why we love asynchronous procedure calls. This is built into the operating system. And what it does is it tells threads to do something. A great example is going to be things like starting a service or terminating a thread. Asynchronous procedure calls, are otherwise known as APCs. This is an awesome way to do injection, specifically using QUser APC, because it happens like 1,000,000 times on your computer. Even if you try to hook into possible APCs firing, it's not going to be practical for any AV or ADR product to actually detect on this, because there's just so many going on that it will essentially die. You'll end up DOSing your computer if you even try. Same thing with other APIs. I mentioned some APIs on the create remote thread that AVs are using to try to detect the activity that's going on. If you try using the APIs provided by Windows for QUser APC, again, is going to be so many false positives, you're not going to know what's good and what's bad. So this is why we're using QUser APC to do shellcode injection versus create remote thread, which is going to be your vanilla type of shellcode injection. And this right now it's just, I don't see a practical way of detecting it right now. Another advantage of working at FireEye as a product company is that we have endpoint products that are very advanced, and we can detect on a lot of good activity. But on the same side, I can see what we can't detect. And in this case, we're having a big problem detecting any sort of injection using QUser APC. Next slide, please. So here's a really good example of a basic shellcode injection C# application that we wrote internally. And as you can see, it has hex. This is like just basic, raw shellcode hex right there that you can pass into a byte array. And we use 4 calls pretty much to inject this, or in this case, execute it. Virtual alloc, marshal copy, create thread, wait for single object. This number 3 is the one I kind of want to point out here, because this is just going to spawn a new process as a child process of whatever was executing the shellcode. So the reason why this is kind of interesting is because this is not injection at all. This is just creating a child process. So I want y'all to keep that in mind, because a child process of a parent process can be a heuristic detection in itself. So for example, if you have PowerShell executing, let's just say shellcode.exe is your shellcode name. That's obviously going to be some sort of like heuristic in itself, because PowerShell never executes that child process ever. So it's an easy detection to have. So that's just something I want to mention on the create thread approach, which is still a very common approach. And again, this is not injection, this is just execution. Next slide, please. Here's another example of the exact same thing, but instead of using straight hex, we're base64 encoding the hex, calling another function to decode the hex, and then executing it the exact same way. We use those same calls that I mentioned before. Marshal copy, virtual alloc, create remote thread, wait for single object, or create thread in this case. And so you can do different things. You can finagle the shellcode however you want to, so that if any sort of AV vendors or other detection products actually have regular expressions on assemblies or even common source code, like a CS file, for example, that you want to pass into something else like MS build, then you can bypass some of that using things like base64 encode. But this is actually not a great way of doing it, because it's just encoding, and it's not common still that you're going to see straight hex or base64, a long string anyway, of base64 encoded shellcode in a source code file. Next slide. So that's why we want to go to something like this. This is actually kind of an interesting thing. Again, same method: virtual alloc, marshal copy, create thread, wait for single object. Same API calls, all the same goodness of a shellcode injector. The difference is we base 64 encode our shellcode, and then we export using a private key that we have that we decoded in memory. So the cool thing about this is there's no regular expression for XOR because it's going to be different every single time. That's just the nature of encryption. The second thing is you're not going to have, as you notice, we're appending this variable, which is our shellcode, line by line. Generally, we use column of 80, and then on the 80 column, we append it to a new line. And what this does is it reduces the entropy of the binary itself, which also has a detection for AVs. Again, entropy, AVs use entropy a lot for different sort of detections as well. So again, if you try to append a long string of shellcode, then you will not get detected on entropy. So that's kind of like the foundation about shellcode execution and shellcode injection. And so again, I wanted to give you guys a pretty good foundation on the difference between the two and explain why one's important over the other. So now I kind of want to talk about how we execute this shellcode. Again, with what we talked about before is mainly just building out the payload or building out your shellcode. So the next thing is that's code execution, which is essentially shellcode injection or execution. But now we have to have command execution, a way to actually execute this, right? So we like to use lol bins. Lol bins are essentially living off the land binaries that you can use on any Windows system. So what this means is that they're native applications built into the Windows system that you can take advantage of to actually execute whatever payload that you have. Next slide, please. So a lot of people don't understand how this works. They're just like, okay, you know, this guy, and specifically Sub T or Casey Smith, he does a lot of the original research around using native binaries for code execution. But the way it actually works is through these unmanaged exports within these native binaries. And what that means is that there's an actual export or entry point within a specific application, or in this case, a lol bin, that executes arbitrary code for in this case. So if you had a way to call the same entry point or export in this case that's unmanaged within C#, you can execute arbitrary code if, again, you're calling the same export in this case. So this 4 lines of code right here is a really basic example of how you can accomplish this and use a native binary to call, in this case, thing.0.exec, which is going to be a shellcode runner. So let's kind of go into that a little bit more. Next slide, please. So well, before I get into that, we can talk about using lol bins all day, but you still will get detected on lol bins on 2 things. One's going to be command line arguments, which I'll talk about in a moment. And then the second is going to be parent-to-child process behavior or heuristics. So like I mentioned, if PowerShell executes malware.exe, you know, as a child process, that child process malware.exe may have been shellcode within the DLL itself that you're executing, for example, but it never touched disk, or maybe it's in memory if you're using reflection. And let's just say it's a DLL. A DLL is not an executable. It's going to be executed per se, because in this case, it's just going to be used by a lol bin in this case. So the reason why this spawning the parent-child process behavior is so important is because if you do injection versus, again, create thread, which is going to be execution, you can avoid this behavior and avoid detection altogether. A good example of this is regserve32, which again is a native binary, part of the lol bins. Let's just say that's spawned by WinWord, Excel, or PowerPoint. And this is actually a common theme because if let's say, for example, you're doing a phishing email and you have, for example, a macro, and within that macro, your payload is fileless. A fileless payload is going to be something that you don't actually need a file on disk to execute. In that case, it will maybe accept a URL like regserve32 does, for example. So if regserve32 is spawned, though, as a child process of any one of these native applications like WinWord or whatever, that's an obvious detection. And if FireEye HX does this, a lot of other EDR products do this, AV vendors are starting to do this, as they're looking at parent-to-child process behaviors for any sort of detection. So if you notice, I mentioned command line arguments. This right here is the simple command that you can use with regserve32 to execute, in this case, an SCT file, which is otherwise known as a scriptlet file. And that contains things like VBS. It could contain JScript. We like to use .NET to JScript to execute our shellcode within these SCT files. But if you notice, look at all these switches. You have /s/n/u. You have to have /i plus your URL in order to execute your SCT file. And then if you notice at the end, it has scrobj.dll, which is a DLL required to actually do this activity. That's a really simple command line argument that actually doesn't happen very often on the Windows system, at least legitimately. So again, command line arguments, if you're capturing this, which again, all your modern day EDR products, again, FireEye checks, Cylance, Carbon Black, they're all going to be monitoring command line arguments. And then if anyone has sysmon and they're monitoring the event log for command line arguments as well, they're going to be capturing this activity. So that's what I mean by fileless again, is that there's going to be no actual file on disk. It's going to be hosted somewhere in the cloud and then executed using a native binary. Next slide, please. So another example is going to be PowerShell. You know, everyone's like, yeah, PowerShell is like the greatest when it comes to like using, you know, code execution and malicious execution, whatever. Like PowerShell is kind of like a 5 years ago thing that we don't actually use as much these days. You have invoke expression and you have encoded command. It's a PowerShell, TAC no profile, TAC W with a hidden window, and then you have invoke expression or encoded command. And that's generally what it's going to be. Those command line arguments never happen legitimately. So you're going to get caught based on command line arguments alone with PowerShell. So this is why we don't actually use this that often anymore. MS Build is another example. MS Build is a native binary that calls CSC as a sub-process to MS Build to compile any sort of CS proj file, which is essentially a C# application with actual source code. And that will be compiled in memory and then executed, which is a great way to get around detection too, because it's all happening in memory and there's no actual executable on disk other than the native MS Build. But the problem with that is that's also starting to get detected because there's going to be a child process of MS Build that's not CSC once your application gets executed. And then on top of that, MS Build has a unique MD5 associated with its binary application. And so another heuristic is whenever MS Build executes, again, a child process with its own native MD5, and it's signed in this case, it's going to get caught. But we have this thing called bit flopping. So if you actually flip the last 2 bits, if you open a hex editor, throw MS Build in it, you actually flip the last 2 bits to some arbitrary bit, it will change the MD5 and it'll still be a signed executable. And that will actually also bypass a lot of detections. So if you just use the native MS Build, you're probably going to get caught. If you have your own in your back pocket where you did the bit flipping or bit flopping technique that I just mentioned, you will probably get past a lot of detections these days. Next slide. So I kind of want to make 2 distinctions here. I mentioned MS Build, Regserve32, PowerShell, things like that. These all fall under the category of executing a .NET assembly, specifically source code. MSHTA will execute an HTA file, which is going to use .NET to JavaScript with a simple HTA file. MS Build, like I mentioned, CS proj. And then these other 2, you can have a DLL, but you don't actually have to call an unmanaged export. Whereas these ones over here on the right, everyone's probably familiar with NetSH, control.exe. Control.exe is your control panel. So I'm going to show you a way that we weaponize these native binaries to execute all of our shellcode. And I might actually have demos to do it as well. But these do require those unmanaged exports that I mentioned that you have to call in order to execute your shellcode, like I mentioned in one of the earlier sites. Next slide, please. So here's my demo. Again, kind of hard to see. But if you notice here, this is my shellcode. I call an unmanaged export, in this case called CPI applet. I compile my DLL. I'm going to copy my DLL to desktop, and I just have to rename the file extension to a CPL file, which is the file extension that control.exe requires. I double click it, it pops calc, and that's all I wanted to do. And then I kind of look at the behavior in this case. Next slide, please. And I break it out here. Like I mentioned, this is the exact same shellcode I just executed in the demo I just showed you. And if you notice, again, I have to call CPL applet, which is the unmanaged export required to take advantage of this. And then I run my shellcode, which in this case is base64 encoded shellcode. And then I looked at Process Explorer, and I said, okay, what's actually happening? So control.exe, again, a native binary that you can use to execute your shellcode, runs DLL32, that then runs calc.exe. So 2 things to mention here, because I've been harping on this all day. One is command line arguments. So in this case, it runs run DLL32, entry point, my specific CPL file, and it's a done deal. This actually happens really often on any sort of legitimate Windows system, because we've done this analysis for our FireEye HX appliance, and it's hard to detect based on command line arguments because, again, that exact command does happen actually pretty often. So we're trying to find a way to actually get around that. And the way we're doing that is parent-to-child process execution. Again, control.exe, running run-dll32 with an arbitrary executable. Obviously, when I'm doing this for reals, I'm not going to be executing calc, right? I'm going to do like my actual shellcode. In this case, let's just say malware.exe. So the interesting thing about this is the parent-to-child process will get me caught here. And that's where I want to go back to the Q-user APC shellcode injection. If you do something like Q-user APC shellcode injection, you inject into a separate process, there will never be anything spawned under control.exe in that situation. So any sort of parent-to-child process behavior detection will be bypassed. So that's definitely something important to note. Next slide, please. Here's another example. I have control.writeline, Evan Loves Texas Cyber Summit, running my shellcode, a different entry point, or unmanaged export in this case. So which one is this one for, right? So I don't even rename the same executable or the same DLL. I'm going to modify this registry key, which is essentially what all of the NetSH helpers are. I'm going to add one just based on a registry key. I call it Evan Pena. I point it to my DLL. I click OK. And now I'm just going to simply run NetSH. Again, a native binary, right? And if you notice, it executes my calc. It also executes my string, Evan Loves Texas Cyber Summit, all within NetSH, which again is a native binary. So I can execute anything I want, again, using any one of these lulbins if I use the same exact approach that I'm using for every single one of them. Unmanaged exports, shellcode loader, and then just calling it the way we normally would. Next slide, please. This one's even crazier. Again, this is the registry tree. You can add any helper to it. You can also run NetSH add helper path to your DLL to add the same helper. This is not a good approach because they're going to have command line arguments to adding a helper. Any sort of EDR that's capturing command line arguments is going to capture this command that you run in the command prompt. So if you actually do it via the registry, there's no command line arguments ever passed. So if you actually look at this, the command line is just NetSH because I added Evan Peña into this specific registry key. So how are you going to detect on command line arguments when it's literally just NetSH? That's actually really difficult to do. So again, going back to parent-to-child process, this is how you would get detected right there. So one more time, going back to Q-user APC injection, you will not get detected because it will be injected into a separate process. And so NetSH will never have a child process in this specific case if you're using Q-user APC. I'm hoping that makes sense. I'm trying to say it a lot, but I just want to keep harping on it because that's a really important concept to understand. Next slide, please. So again, this is kind of just going over everything I mentioned. This is probably your best practice here. Use APC for injection, again using Q-user APC. XOR plus concatenation for your shellcode handling. So when you create that same shellcode runner that I've been reusing over and over again, XOR it, use concatenation to reduce entropy, and you'll likely bypass a lot of detections just based on that alone. Combine these techniques and make your favorite all the things type of shellcode injection. So if you look over here, I'm calling different unmanaged exports, and I'm using the same function. The same function is that shellcode injector that I kind of showed you at the beginning. All you have to do is add a different unmanaged export, and the binary itself is going to handle it for you because it's looking for that entry point within the DLL to actually execute your shellcode. So I have an all-in-one script, right, or in this case source code, that I compile. It is then a DLL, and any one of the ones I showed you that we're taking advantage of, control, NetSH, install util, regasm, any one of those will end up finding the entry point that it wants, and then it's going to execute my shellcode. So there's a lot more, obviously, than what's just shown in here. This is just a small example of one that I have in my source code. That lulbins link that I put in one of the earlier slides, that has pretty much a list of all the current ones right now. Exactly. Let him do the research, and then you just kind of, spin off whatever you want from it. And it still works all the time, and it's going to continue working for a long time. That's exactly what you should be doing. And Casey Smith, otherwise known as Sub T, he's kind of the pioneer behind a lot of this research. We do some of that internally at Mandiant FireEye, which we haven't released because we have to use it for some of our covert operations. But a lot of the ones that are public, you can still take advantage of and get away with everything if you're using these methods here. Next slide. So the next thing I want to talk about is persistence. So if you notice, what I'm kind of doing is, again, I'm building it out. You have your shellcode payload now, and then you can use that for lateral movement if you want, which we're going to talk about, or you can use it for persistence, which I'll talk about in a moment as well. Next slide. So the first one I want to talk about are user login scripts. I have a link to where this was originally posted in terms of research. But essentially, there's this HK or current user environment path that has this user init NPR logon script. This doesn't exist by default. You actually have to create it. So if you create this specific key and you add a scriptlet file, or in this case a VBS, it could even be JScript if you want, JS or VBS, any sort of script file, and you pass it or you add it to that specific key, which we're adding here with this one command, then whenever the user logs in, it's going to execute this. The reason why I like this a lot is because if you get on a system, especially an initial system, and you don't have system level privileges or local admin, you're under current user. So you can still do this as a real quick win persistent script or persistence technique. Now, the other thing I want to mention is a lot of people say, oh, but it's the registry. Everyone looks at the registry for persistence. You know, you're going to get caught. The truth is that's not true. It's actually very difficult to do real-time detection in the registry because there's so much activity going on. Now, I will give you this. If you get caught by something else and someone's doing a live response analysis or forensics on that system, then you may get caught because they have a known set of things that they're going to look for persistence. But in real time, you probably won't get caught at all because, again, real-time detection with the registry is difficult, especially if you're using unique techniques such as the user init one, for example. It's not just a registry run key. This is likely something that it's not as well known because it's just not as much as public. That's like the only link I've really found to this. So that's why it's really important to note, and it's really easy to use and very effective. Now this right here, this is where you're going to get caught. Remember what I mentioned like 100 times now. Command line arguments, right? Reg add, and then certain registry keys will get you caught. So we don't like to run reg add in our red team engagements. We like to use things like going back to the PowerShell. We don't use PowerShell for invoke expression or encoded command, but we may use PowerShell to call WMI to add a registry key because there's actually no command line arguments around that right now. But what's to say they do have command line arguments whenever that time comes? And they are detecting registry activity based on command line arguments only. What you could do still with PowerShell is use PowerPick, which is unmanaged PowerShell that avoids any sort of command line arguments from PowerShell itself. Again, PowerPick, you can Google it. It's public out there. Right now, it has a way to get around any sort of PowerShell command line arguments because it's not actually using PowerShell.exe. It's using unmanaged PowerShell to call it, which is essentially the system.automation library within the Windows API. Next slide. This one is a really cool persistence technique because it's also a vulnerability. Anytime you have unquoted service paths within a service, you can modify that service to execute your service binary before or even to replace the one that it's currently using. So this is a really good example of an unquoted service path. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, the way Windows works is it has to have a quote around the full path or it won't know where the path is. Every space that it has, it's going to think it's an executable. So for example, in this one, if I can write to C and I put c.program or cprogram.exe, it's going to try to call this first. If it doesn't exist, then it's going to try the next space, just add an exe. It's going to try to call that. If that doesn't exist, then it will call the actual service that it wants. So you could take advantage of that and abuse that by writing your executable to disk if you want to, and call yours before it does before it calls the legitimate one. And the reason why this is so cool: no command line arguments. You're not modifying a service. You're not adding any registry keys. You're really not doing anything but saving a file to disk, right? So there's no real-time detection on this kind of activity. It's also, again, a vulnerability. It could be used for privilege escalation as well, depending on if you're not system already and this service is running as system and you can write to that specific path. So that's another really good technique for that as well. Next slide, please. So here's just an example of doing this for persistence as well. You can automate this whole process by using PowerUp. It's within PowerSploit. It's open source, public on GitHub. And what it does is it looks for any unquoted service paths that you may have. It finds any ones that you can modify. It even will create a service binary for you. Forewarning, then if you just use whatever is built into PowerUp, it's going to create a user called John, and I think the password is password. But it's going to do like a net user add. And again, it's going to do it via command line arguments, and that will also get you caught either one of two ways. Either one, command line arguments, because no one's going to be adding local users to your account on an enterprise network. Number two, the event log of a new user was created on that system and added to the local admins group. That rarely ever happens legitimately as well. At least it shouldn't, again, in an enterprise environment. So those are all the ways you're going to be detected. Next. So, but you can modify the payload as opposed to adding a user to execute your arbitrary or whatever it is you want. So you can use the netsh example I gave you. You can use a CPL file like the one I showed you earlier. And there's a lot of other lol bins examples that you would use for your payload execution. Next slide. So here's an example of the command processor one. If you notice, I called CMD, nothing happens. And then I exit CMD. And then I show you, this is my orange.bat file. If I just add a string to this specific registry key, in this case it's called auto run, and then I'm going to put it to my, point it to my bat file, and now I call CMD, it's going to execute whatever is in my bat file in this case. So you can use other persistence to actually take advantage of this. So for example, if in the user init entry key you just call CMD, no one's going to know the difference. They're going to be like, okay, CMD is running. Like, what does it really matter? And the reason why it matters is because there may be other register keys that you're taking advantage of to actually execute your payload. Does that make sense? Okay, next slide, please. So those are kind of our de facto persistence techniques that we're using right now. So the next thing I want to kind of go into is lateral movement. Two main things that we use for lateral movement. RDP blends in with traffic, used legitimately by every sysadmin pretty much. It's very difficult to distinguish between malicious RDP and a legitimate RDP. The way that we see a lot of defenders actually detect on this is based on big data analytics. So you're going to have a SIM, you're going to have a baseline of what users are logging into what, and then you're going to detect on any sort of a user that's logging into a server that's never logged in that server before. That might be a detection. Now, I only see very mature clients actually have this implemented. It's rare that I'll actually see this deployed in real life. I've done several hundred red teams in my career, and I think maybe like 5 have actually implemented that sort of rule, but it was very effective for them. I think it's a difficult rule to apply. So the next one is WMI, which is, again, built into Windows. It's going to be enabled on every single Windows system. There's likely going to be no firewall ACL is going to be blocking you from communicating with other systems. And it's a great way to scale your environment because you can actually wrap a list of systems that you want to execute whatever it is that you want on and just call WMI to automate that wrap. Whereas RDP is more of a GUI-based thing. You can RDP into a single system. It's difficult to scale RDP when it comes to command execution, which is why, again, we use WMI for scaling. But if you want to do like a one-off login, access an application, or just kind of do some looking around and you're on an internal network already, or you're using a SOX proxy to tunnel into a network, RDP is a really good way of doing that. Next slide. So there's a few things I want to point out when it comes to WMI. I like to use WMIExec, which I'm a co-developer of. It's open source. Myself and Chris Trunster developed this, released it to the public. And what's nice about this is it gives you output, like in this case, Mimikatz output, back to the user. A lot of people use WMI and you get like process was executed, but you don't know what happens, right? Like, well, with WMIExec, you'll get any sort of output back. And this only comes into play when you want output. I would never use WMIExec if you don't really care about output. So when would you not care about output? When you just want to execute your payload and get a callback. At that point, you can operate through your backdoor. Why would you care about the output? It's going to say process executed, you're good to go. But if you actually care about output, like in Mimikatz, for example, this is where you may want to use something like WMIExec. We have a remote POSH function that lets you execute arbitrary PowerShell scripts on the remote system. Now, what's even cooler about this is that it doesn't just save invoke Mimikatz on the remote system using SMB. If you look at a lot of these PowerShell WMI scripts, they're actually using SMB to push whatever script they want, and then using WMI to execute that script. That's not true WMI. Okay, that's like kind of using a few protocols in itself to actually make it happen. Well, with with WMI implant, it is pure WMI. What this does is it actually saves this PowerShell script and an attribute of an existing WMI class on the remote system, fully encrypted, and then it uses WMI to decrypt it, pull the data from the class itself, and then execute the PowerShell script from there. And then any sort of output is also saved to that class, again, an existing class within WMI, and then pull back. So nothing's actually saved on disk per se. It's saved within the WMI database, and then it's also coming back, and then it deletes it afterwards. So this is a very purist WMI tool that you can use, again, open source, and I highly recommend you use it when you want user output. Next slide. WMIC is another really good one built into Windows. So this is something that is an advantage for you because, again, it's built into Windows. You can pass it a system. You can do process call create in this case if you want to execute whatever it is that you want. So in the example I gave you before, if you're kind of thinking about it, you can use WMI to add a new registry key for the NetSH helper, for example, and then you can use something like, again, WMI to, or even SMB to push your DLL wherever it is that you want on disk, and then you can use WMIC process call create just to call NetSH, and that will execute your DLL, just like in the demo I showed you earlier. So that's kind of a unique way of doing process execution using WMIC. Again, I don't prefer to use this method if I don't have to because of, again, command line arguments. WMIC, process call create, easy command line argument to detect on. And again, a lot of EDR products are detecting on this, so it's not my preferred way. But if you're really restricted to just Windows, you're on that system, you have to move laterally, and you want to execute something on the remote system, WMIC is a decent way of doing it. Next slide, please. So the next one I want to mention is WMIExec, which is built into any Kali VM, for those of you familiar with Kali. The reason why I will like to use WMIExec is because of two things. One, it supports pass the hash, and two, it avoids command line arguments if you're using a SOX proxy to tunnel into an environment. If you use a SOX proxy to tunnel into an environment and you're actually executing your commands, in this case using WMIExec, to execute a process on the remote system, there's no command line arguments because you're doing it from your attacker system. So that's why it's a really good tradecraft to use a SOX proxy to tunnel into an environment in this case. And you can push your DLLs or whatever you want using the lolbins method that I mentioned earlier, and then just use WMIExec to actually execute whatever it is that you want to execute in this case. I don't like to use the default WMIExec because of all of this right here. It executes a WMI process, which is the first login. It's going to write the process output into the admin $, which in a randomized file, which is another heuristic. And then it's going to read, this is actually 1, 2, 3 logins at this point. It's going to read the file from the admin $ using SMB, and then it's going to delete the file afterwards. And it's going to have an interactive command prompt. So this, the reason it's doing this right here is because it's going to give you output. It's going to be like if you use PSExec, for example, and you have like an interactive command prompt, that's exactly what this does by default. However, if you use the no output option within WMIExec, you won't have that interactive command shell. It's going to do something very similar to what WMIC does, or WMIC, where it executes something and then returns a code saying it executed successfully or it didn't. So next slide, please. The bottom line in this case is you can use WMIExec with that no output. You can pass the hash if you want. You can pass it whatever payload that you want in this case. I don't recommend this one. Again, command line arguments, encoded command. I would recommend one of those lolbin techniques that I just showed you about to execute your process. But the reason why it doesn't matter here is because I don't care about output if I want to just execute my backdoor payload. I'll interact with my beacon, in this case, through whatever interface I'm using, Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, Empire, your custom rat. So, again, if I want output, I'm going to use WMI implant. If I want something like just code execution, this is what I'm going to use, again, with the no output switch. Next slide, please. So that's kind of the bottom line is what I mentioned. Again, WMI implant, you want output back. Use WMIExec with no output or WMIC, but preferably WMIExec tunneling through a system if you can to actually get a callback and you don't care about output. And then use RDP if you kind of just want that one-off, get access to that system, look around. Maybe you want to find out what it's doing or do some more information, but it's just more of a one-off system. Next slide. So thoughts overall for this. Shellcode injection is the best way to execute your backdoor payload. Again, it used to kind of be create thread, which is just shellcode execution, or just using shellcode injection for the initial vector. But we like to use shellcode injection now for everything because of that parent-child process behavior detection I mentioned earlier. There's a ton of ways of doing executing your shellcode using legitimate binaries. Again, I recommend everyone go to that lolbin site that I put in my slides earlier. That is like money when it comes to all the latest research on the native executables that you can take advantage of right now. Again, use your APC for process injection over create remote thread because it happens all the time legitimately. No AVs can hook into this and actually detect on anything right now. And there's a lot of lateral movement and persistence techniques that you can use in conjunction with your shellcode injection techniques to actually execute your payloads. Next slide. So that's kind of like a lot of technical stuff about lateral movement, persistence, payload generation. Now I'm going to kind of go into some fun case studies about how we're creative when we're actually doing red teaming. A lot of people think, or I don't want to say think, but they kind of say like, oh, pen testers, red teamers, they're just clicking buttons and doing crap all day. Like, so that's not at all how we do it here at Mandiant anyway. This is a really good example that I'm going to give you 3 case studies that we have to really be creative. And that software development / IT background that I mentioned is actually really important to how we accomplish our goals. So I'll explain that here in a moment. Next slide. So this first one, we had a building manufacturer company come to us and say, hey, Evan, I want to do a red team with you and your team. Can you help us out? And the guy that was our point of contact for this specific case was actually a previous client of mine with 2 different other customers. So he had moved 3 different times, and every single time he went to a new vendor, he used us as his vendor for doing the pen testing or red teaming for his company. So we had a lot of pressure to really perform and accomplish the objectives that he wants because we want to make sure that he still comes to us any other company that he goes to. The main objective was to access the CEO's email. So we did our initial vector via phishing. We escalated privileges, performed lateral movement, but we couldn't get domain admin because in this specific client, they had a red force implementation that was actually physically separated from the logical network. So there was no way that we could think of within the amount of time we had to get domain admin. But the objective was, again, to access the CEO's email. We had server admin access, and we even had help desk admin access, and they had a really good segregation of credentials and privileges. So we could actually access most people's systems that we wanted to. So generally, the approach is going to be, I'm going to target wherever the CEO's system is. I'm going to jump on that system, use Mimikatz to dump credentials from memory, and then just access his email via OA or Outlook or whatever I want, right? Well, this CEO used an iPad for like his everyday activity. The dude just cared about email and internet, I guess, and he just wanted to use an iPad. So I can't go on an iPad, dump Mimikatz, or run Mimikatz and get creds, right? So how am I going to do it? One thought was accessing the domain controller, dumping the ntds.dit file, maybe pulling his hash and cracking it. But remember, I can't access the domain controller. So I'm like, dang, what do I do, right? So what I did was I targeted the Exchange servers. I got the Exchange admin's credentials from memory from the Exchange server. I went into Office 365 in this case because they had on-prem and cloud Exchange servers that were in sync. I used his authentication to access it, and then I used email delegation rules in order to access the CEO's email. So again, this was a creative approach to accomplishing the same objective without actually just going straight to the CEO and thinking that's the only route to accomplish my objective. Does that make sense to everyone? Great. Next slide. That's a great question. So one of the outcomes for this, it was not detected because they were not logging anything on email delegation rules. There was no Exchange logging. So one of the biggest outcomes was logging and alerting when email delegation rules happen. You baseline this, and then you detect. You can send the logs to your SIM and then create alerting around that. That was a really big outcome for this specific scenario. Exactly. Next slide, please. So here's another really good one. So same situation, trying to accomplish our objective. We couldn't access a lot of different systems, specifically in an ATM environment. The ATM environment was completely segmented. They want us to do this like jackpotting technique logically. Like, we really want you to get code execution on all these ATM systems, but they were like, you know, I couldn't see them anywhere on the network from corporate. And that's where we started. We couldn't move laterally to those systems. So one, again, creative technique was they had Carbon Black in this specific case deployed everywhere, enterprise-wide. And then I was like, you know, I was able to access the Carbon Black console, and they had the live response. They had the live response feature enabled within Carbon Black. And I was like, let me look into this live response feature. The live response feature has an API associated with it. And I was reading through this API. Put file, get file, registry adds, right? Execute, memory dumps. So if I wanted to, I could do a memory dump on every single system using the API if I had the token, which in this case I had, via the admin console. And I could pull LSAS from every single system if I wanted to. I could do code execution on every single system if I wanted to, just using the application itself, or in this case, the API. I could write a simple Python script to wrap the API and get code execution on every single system in the entire enterprise. So in this, again, the key here, it didn't matter if I got domain admin, exchange admin. All I really cared about here was getting the Carbon Black admin, and that got me system level privileges on every single system in the entire enterprise, just by wrapping the API, but mainly, again, because they didn't protect the access token, or the auth token in this case, that allowed me to interface with the API. So again, a creative technique to get code execution on every single system without, again, getting the actual domain admin privileges that most people think that you need to accomplish your objectives. Next slide. And the last one I want to mention is using Symantec, or in this case, Altiris. Exact same situation, but it wasn't ATMs. In this case, it was point of sale systems. And it was the same thing. I could use Altiris in this case to execute a job, which you can't see that well probably from afar, but this is running who am I and then IP config within the job on a single system using the Symantec Manager agent credentials right there, built into every single agent deployed on the enterprise. And then when I execute that job, I got, in this case, system, because every single command was running as system. So they didn't lock down the privileges for this service, probably because they have to deploy patches and whatnot through this application. And then the second one was IP config. So this is why it's important, in this case, for us as red teamers to really think creatively about the problem that you're trying to approach and understand everything that's available to you to accomplish that problem or accomplish your objective. And the second thing as defenders is to understand that just because you think like an exchange admin or domain admin, enterprise admin is your crown jewels, it may not be it. You have to think of other things that interface with every single system in the enterprise and lock those down too, whether it be two-factor authentication, a lot of ACLs, just restricting the admin to that system alone so that no other system can access the application if they wanted to. There's a lot of different ways you can lock these things down to avoid this situation in real life. Next slide, please. And that's pretty much everything in one. I know it's a lot of information to take in, so I think we have a few minutes for questions. So I think we have just about 5 or 10 minutes. Yes, sir. So sometimes if you want to talk like east-west, let's just say it's two different network segments and there's an actual appliance in between two. Yeah, so in that situation, they can detect on certain things, especially output that's not encrypted, like Mimikatz output over SMB, stuff like that will always get detected, which is why that WMI implant stuff encrypts the data over the network. So if it's fully encrypted in some form or fashion, it'll likely bypass that. But if you're just doing raw SMB payloads being sent or even output, you're going to get caught. Any additional questions? Don't be shy. Yes, ma'am. That's a really good question. So the question was, Mimikatz currently, there's invoked Mimikatz via PowerShell that uses reflection to inject into LSAS. That's going to be using that create remote thread that I mentioned earlier. So if you use QUser APC to do either Mimikatz DLL injection or even shellcode injection, if you can create a shellcode version of Mimikatz which exists, you can use QUser APT to inject into LSAS as opposed to using reflection, which is create remote thread, to avoid a lot of detections. I don't know if you have noticed this, which I guess is your observation. A lot of these AV products are detecting Mimikatz being run because of the way it injects into LSAS. So it's a really good observation. You can use QUser APT using that same method to avoid that detection. Any additional questions?
One quick one. You mentioned that some of these techniques you're making use of based on intel real-life incident breach responses that FireEye is working on. Can you list just a couple of APT actors out there that are making use of these same techniques that we're emulating?
Great question. APT 29 is one big one. APT 10 is another big one. APT 1 was another big one that we used to use a lot of their techniques, but we started turning away from it. I would say APT 19 and APT 29 are the closest that replicate us. Funny story about that, actually, is because we have a managed defense service, which is essentially like a managed SOC, and we obviously have a lot of agents and product deployed out to the world. We have attribution on these groups based on a lot of the intel that we gain from our products and also our managed defense clients. So we actually have an UNC, which is an unknown. APT is generally nation state. We have FIN, which is related to financial groups that we track often. When we have UNC groups, UNK, which is like an unknown group that we attribute a lot of certain activity to that UNC number. Well, we have our own UNC number for the red team, like where they see us. And we're actually making T-shirts. That's like our logo now, like our UNC number that Mandiant has attributed all activity to. So we have our own kind of APT style group, but it's under an UNC category. Yes, sir, in the back. That's a great question too, actually. One, they have two different reputations, for those of you who don't know. But two, the Mandiant brand is still the services arm of FireEye. So anytime I say Mandiant, it's one, generally going to be probably someone that used to work at Mandiant before the acquisition. And then number two, it's going to be someone who's on the services side of FireEye that's still just kind of branded under the Mandiant arm as a brand. But technically, we're FireEye. So that's they own us, they acquired us, so that's who we're under officially. Any additional questions? I have my Twitter handle there and my email if you all are interested in learning more about it or have any additional questions. We're also hiring, so for anyone who wants to submit a resume, please feel free to submit to any one of us. We're pretty much in the central region, but we have offices all over the world, really. So whatever location you're at, I'm sure we have an office in. I'll probably be around for another 5 minutes afterwards if you have any questions you want to privately ask me afterwards. Thank you all very much.